Hi. Hello, Washington, D.C. It is very nice to see you guys today. How many of you have had a chance to read Liz's book? Okay. Those of you who have not, you are in for a treat. But what I am going to tell you is we go spoiler-free when Liz and I hang out because I don't believe in wrecking a reading experience for other people. And since Liz is always willing to play along with me, sorry, should I be using your actual byline, Elizabeth? Can I call you Liz? Okay.
Everyone here can call me Liz. It's very exciting.
Okay. This book is a joy and a delight, and it is witty, and it is fun. Obviously, we are down a person. We were expecting Jess Walter to be able to join us. Unfortunately, he's not here. There are a couple of moments, though, where he is going to jump into the program with us because he had some cool things to say, and I still want to play with Liz on those very specific things. But really, remember, there is a book signing after this portion. So please, do go buy Liz's book. Please get it signed. If you don't have a chance, you can also get it from your library as well, right? We love our libraries. More importantly, how many of you have read Middlemarch? Okay, how many of you are now wondering what Middlemarch has to do with a novel about marriage and politics set in New Jersey in the present day?
Should we tell them what the novel is about?
Yes, we're going to.
Very exciting.
But I just wanted to, I like playing with the audience first. You know this.
Yes, ma'am.
We've done this live before. You know this.
We have.
Okay, so that said, I'm going to ask Liz to introduce How to Sleep at Night and the four most important characters and the extra 5-year-old. But let's start with the adults in the room.
All right. Well, so the book is about basically what happens when who you are in the world doesn't match how you see yourself. So there's a woman who's become a stay-at-home mom by accident, and it's a terrible fit for her, and she feels like an accessory in her husband's life. That's Nicole. There is a woman whose career is her entire world, but it's a job she's come to hate, and that is Kate. And then there are two men who are married. One is liberal, one is conservative, and then as the book begins, the conservative decides to run for office. So those are the adults, and then there are some excellent children, if I do say so myself.
They are very excellent children who sound like children and not mini adults, which we appreciate. I want to start a little sideways, though, before we come back to the novel. Why do you read?
Ooh, why do I read? Let's see. I read for many reasons. So my day job is I cover books and publishing, so I have to read. So there's that one. I get in trouble if I do not. I read because, I don't know about anyone else here, but I get really cranky when I don't read. It just sort of makes me like not a very nice person. I don't know what it is about that. I was sort of thinking about that recently, and I think like there's like a particular part of your brain you use, right, when you're just sort of imagining yourself in somebody else's life that you don't really get anywhere else. And I think that's the main reason, right? Is like you get to inhabit other people's lives in a way that you don't, even if you're watching something, you're a witness, right? But if you're reading a book, you're in there, you're like in the thoughts and you're in the interiority. So it's like just such a way to like widen your existence. And I'm greedy, I guess, right? You know, I just want to like live as many lives as possible. And like I read The Night Watchman recently. I just finished it a couple weeks ago, the Louise Erdrich book from a couple years ago, and it was so great. And it's about a Native American community on a reservation in the early 1950s, and there was this movement from the federal government to try and abolish reservations and all treaties with Native Americans, which I didn't know anything about. But it wasn't a polemic. It wasn't just sort of kind of trying to hammer this message. It was just sort of these people living through this time, and so it wasn't just the learning what happened. It was learning what it felt like, and it was just great. And also, someone at some point is like working as a burlesque dancer, like swimming in a fish tank. It's like wearing a blue costume. It's very strange, but it was great. So
That book is a really great example of letting character drive the story.
Yeah.
Right. And you are also a writer driven by character. And one of the things, and one of the reasons I read, honestly, is because I get to spend time with people that I wouldn't necessarily meet otherwise, right? And it's not just the interiority of their lives, but it's me sort of jumping into the pool, right, and saying, hi, who are you? Right? Like the book is a perfect time travel device, right? We saw this, when you can't necessarily get out of the house the way you'd like to, you've got a book. Or you can, what's the word I'm looking for?
spy, eavesdrop?
Eavesdrop.
Yes.
I like eavesdropping. I am an inveterate eavesdropper. Anyone who has shared a meal with me, and Liz is one of these people, knows that I will suddenly like start listening to whatever's happening at the table next to me. Which, grace and favor, right? Like we all have that friend who's just like, hi, hello world, I want to be part of this. But I want to come back to writing about marriage. I mean, it is one of those classic storylines, right? Like, guy walks into a bar, woman leaves her marriage, somebody dies. Marriage is
That's not what the book's about.
This is not, this is not the book, right? Like, you guys read enough to know that there are so many tropes in the world, right? But I do, like, marriage is endlessly fascinating for people who are married, for people who are not married.
I
But
agree.
you start with a marriage.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea for the book kind of started with there are several couples in my extended family who don't agree with their spouse politically, and I don't think this has ever been like anyone's like favorite part of their marriage, but it has gotten a lot harder in the last 10 years. But they're all still married, and they're all happily married, and I sort of just started thinking like, God, it's so interesting. Like, I wonder how that works. But I really didn't want to write a book about politics. I wanted to write a book about marriage, and sort of then tried to kind of think about sort of how to kind of blow it out from there. Like I think the idea of having your spouse run for office sounds terrible to most of us, especially if you don't agree with them. But I started thinking kind of what's actually so unpleasant about this, right? And some of the things that I sort of came to first were the idea that you kind of become famous for these ideas that you detest, right? And then the other is you have to kind of figure out where your lines are, like how far can you go to support a person you love without kind of compromising your own values and that sort of thing. And the idea of kind of disappearing into another person's story, like that I think is very universal and happens a lot in marriage, right? And I think the idea that you kind of lose track of who you are, and I think that happens to a lot of us. Like, you graduate from college and suddenly you're trying to be an adult in the world, or you get to middle age and you kind of look around like, oh, I came all this way for this, oh, or like you retire and you're saying like, who the hell am I? Oh God, like those kinds of things. And then I think in a marriage, like it's an extra dimension, right? Because you're trying to grow together, and when that does or doesn't happen, I think is really fascinating. So that was this. It's really a book about relationships and two marriages and another relationship, and that was the thing. I mean, I could think about that all day. I find that just fascinating. And like being with a person for a really long time, if you think about it, it's just kind of an insane prospect, right? Like that you're going to meet someone when you're 20 or 25 or even 30 or 40 or whatever, and then be with them for like 40 years or 50 years. Like, who the hell? What?
Listen, it was not part of my plan, and suddenly it showed up, and I was like, oh,
Right.
okay, I guess we're doing this. But writing about marriage does also bring us to writing about ambition, and whose ambition comes first, and when, and how that changes.
Yeah.
And ambition gets messy, right? Like, it's really easy for us to stand back and look at headlines or what have you and say, well, how did we get here? Right? How do you, and you alluded to it a little bit a minute ago when you said, well, how much do you support the person you love? Because you know them in a way that maybe the outside world doesn't.
Totally. And I think ambition, just as like a human, I find ambition so interesting because it really changes so much. Like, what you want when you're in your 20s, very different than in your 40s, and, kind of moving on from there. But yeah, I think, and that's like a real challenge in a marriage, right? Is to sort of figure out who goes first at any given point. And so there's, that's kind of happening there's three narrators basically, and the sort of two things that come up a lot, there's sort of relationships and there's ambition, and sort of how the woman who the woman who became a stay-at-home mom by accident, for example, like had like big plans for herself and was very ambitious, but like just life happens, right? Like she kind of ended up in a job that wasn't quite right, and then she got laid off when she was pregnant, and then you might as well stay home because like, oh my God, how much money do you need to pay for childcare? And then suddenly you've been out of the workforce for 10 years. And like that, I think also is something that people, is a really common thing that I've seen happen a lot with good friends and things like that. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about.
But you're writing about ambition in a way where you're not cynical about it. It's really, ambition is one of those things that it's really easy to get very cynical about very quickly. And if you were to do that with Ethan, Or even Nicole, right? Even Nicole, who's the stay-at-home mom.
Ethan is the guy running for office.
Right, sorry. To put too much of an emphasis on the ambition, right? Then you lose their humanity, right?
Yeah, I feel like I've gotten to like here I am in middle age, and I feel like I'm like very much at peace with everyone's ambition. Like if you want to like run the world, like hats off, like don't step on people on your way up. Otherwise, go for it. And if you really have no interest at all, fantastic. You know, like I feel like there's a lot of judgment, especially when we're younger, about kind of where people want to go in either direction. And I think that's, and I just, you know, who are we to tell anybody what they want? And I mean, also like a note about that in terms of sort of the being a stay-at-home mom thing, like I think for her it is a very bad fit, but like hats off, you know, like it is such a hard job and it is a wonderful job and I 100% see the appeal of it, but it's just not for everybody. So I think that's trying to have respect for kind of what everybody wants and the guy who wants to run for office as well. So even though, God, personally, no. But
you and I have talked about this in previous conversations, though, where language, right? And I think this is a huge part of how you sidestep caricature, is the emphasis you place on language and story, and that you do, in fact, read a lot of poetry.
I do. You're so nice. Isn't she so nice? So all these nice things. Sorry.
A fan, but she did the work. But I do want to talk about language for a second because I think it's really easy sometimes for us, especially reading a book is such an intimate experience, right? Like there's this idea that it's a passive thing that you do and you sit in your lap and you do a thing, right? But actually reading it pushes you, it pushes your empathy, it pushes your brain. I mean, in some cases it's a cinematic unscrolling of a story, right? Like just depending on what kind of book you're reading. But coming back to you, that language, right? Like the witty dialogue and the set pieces. Okay, there's a snake that gets lost. I'm not spoiling anything. There's a snake that gets lost.
Fang. Fang forever.
Fang gets lost.
Yeah.
But the idea that you can use these tools, right, to let the story unfold, I got really attached to all of these characters. And when I get that attached to a character, my first thought is, oh, right, ideas are really about people, right? Like if we don't have the right characters to lock into, you could be reading fantasy, you could be reading science fiction, you could be reading, you know, a giant history of the Tudors, right? You get attached to the people.
I hope so, yeah. I would, can I say something about Fang, just because
Yes.
I really enjoy Fang? So this is my first novel, and there's often sort of an assumption that sort of like there's a lot of you or your life in your novel, and it's really not the case with this. And I think part of that was because I'm a reporter as my day job, and I wanted to write like real fiction, like I write nonfiction all day long, but the pets are all real. There was, in fact, a Fang. There was a snake that looked like a candy cane that my friend had, or his son had, and it escaped into the wilds of New Jersey. And so that was fun. There was a real leopard gecko. So that's commitment to the truth here. Here we are.
Why didn't you need to write a more
Autofiction?
yeah, I mean, autofiction's a thing right now. You could have done it.
Yeah.
You absolutely could have done it.
I don't know. I think part of being a reporter is being interested in like the best reporters are not interested in what they think, right? Like I'm not the best reporter, but I already know what I think. I don't care what I think, right? Like I want to talk to other people and find out what they think and why they think it and how they operate. And I think that's really been like drilled into me over the last 20 years. And so I just didn't seem that interesting to write about my own life. Like there's a journalist in the book because there's a character who had to be a workaholic. And I wrote this book while working full time and my kids were, I think, 2 and 5 when I started, which was stupid, but that's okay. And let's see, and I just had no time for anything. And so I was like, someone is a workaholic, which means they can be a journalist, which is what I am, or a doctor, which is what my wife is. Those are my 2 choices. And so I picked the one that made more sense with the story. But yeah, no, I feel like, you know, I'm more interested in exploring other people. And to your poetry point, so I wish I could write poetry, but oh no, I cannot. I will not ever subject anyone else to that, but I love reading it. And one thing I found when trying to write this book was in like the early drafting process, it was very hard for me to read fiction because I was worried I was worried that the voice would get messed up, that like my characters would start behaving like their characters basically. So I could do it, which I had to for work sometimes. So I could do it, but I had to read it really, really fast in just a couple of days. And other than that, I had to stay away from it for a few months. But poetry I could read, and it was a really wonderful way to just be reminded of sort of like the rhythm of a sentence and the shape of the words, and just like trying to make that beautiful.
Okay, but isn't it possible too that the poetry is what gets you closer to the interiority? It's that mix of your day job, right? And asking all the questions and wanting to know what other people think and not really caring what you think necessarily, but also needing the language to actually capture the genuine emotion of the thing, right? Like, doesn't that?
That's a very good point. I had not thought about that. Yes.
Okay.
But it's interesting, like the interiority is the part that's furthest from journalism, right? Like, because I've been a reporter for I've been a reporter at the Times for 16 years, and I've been there for 20.
Okay.
And yeah, like, you want to kind of draw people out and like let people see what they're thinking and that kind of thing. But actually, like inhabiting somebody's mind, that was a totally new thing I had never done before. And that was really like. That took a lot of like conscious thought of like, oh yes, what are they? Oh yeah, like that's not, So that was kind of really fun to kind of figure out in the drafting process. But I had not thought about that about poetry. You're totally right.
I think about a lot of stuff. I really do. And my brain just doesn't stop.
Mine does. After this, we're done.
No. But you have also used Mrs. Dalloway as a reference point. And if we're talking about interiority, right, you can't not talk about Virginia Woolf. You read Dalloway in college.
So I read it for the first time in high school.
High school, okay.
And go ahead.
Blows your mind wide open. Makes you, in fact, want to be a writer. Okay, so what was it about Dalloway?
I think there were a lot of things. I mean, I think in high school, like one of them was that there's like, it's a little gay, honestly. And that was like the first time I'd read a classic that was. And I was like, oh, kind of aware that this had been around forever, but also like I hadn't really encountered it in that space before. And I think that really, I was like kind of figuring, I think I was 17 when I read it. So I was still kind of figuring myself out very much. And that really blew my mind.
Okay.
And I think that was one piece of it. And then I reread it in college. And then I sort of had a more like, not to sound pretentious, but like more of a craft interaction with it. It's sort of like, how did she do that? Because like, not a lot happens, right? And yet it, at least for me, it really moves, and you really experience a lot and that kind of thing. And there's a thing actually Virginia Woolf once wrote, and I can't remember where, about like a true work of art is something that every time you read it, it's different. And which is so true, and like so true for that book, because then I read it a few years later, and I had a totally different experience of it and that kind of thing. And like, I mean, obviously, my books are very different, but which feels a ridiculous thing to say. But like, there's, I'm not ever going to be a writer who does that much interiority, and but it's kind of interesting that is, it's still, if I had, like, that's my one Desert Island book, if I had to pick one.
Okay.
So.
And what I love about your Desert Island book, too, is there's a direct lineage, right, from Ulysses, which Woolf always struggled to read. She did not enjoy reading.
I've never read
straight up,
it.
that woman did not enjoy reading Ulysses. Which also calls back to the Odyssey, right? So here, there's this idea, right, that Woolf is writing these tiny domestic novels, right, these domestic stories. And yet, if you look at the lineage, right, okay, the Odyssey, Ulysses, and then Mrs. Dalloway gets us to Michael Cunningham and The Hours, which is one of the most beautiful books in the world. Again, opens with, the scene set in the 50s in Pasadena, where we've got a stay-at-home mom who is having a very, very bad day, and everything goes from there. And also Christopher Isherwood's A Single Man.
No,
If you look at the structure there, right? So the idea that you can pull in this modern day, very witty send-up of marriage and the moment we're living in, and there is this direct lineage of all of these books. I mean, right? Books providing context for each other, that any book is in conversation with whatever came before. That's the fun of it. I mean, you and I have had conversations before about the writers that made you. Obviously, there's Virginia Woolf. And then, of course, there is the one and only George Eliot. And part of the joke with George Eliot is that Jess Walter feels very strongly about Middlemarch and is very fond of this book. And if you've read The Cold Millions, you can see the line from Middlemarch to Steinbeck to The Cold Millions. So Far Gone is a slightly different reading experience, but there's very much of a sort of American West, what does it mean, what does masculinity mean now kind of thing. But there's, again, you can see the line from his predecessors. And then you get Middlemarch, which you read while you were writing.
Mm-hmm. Who else was an English major, by the way? We're just very much like,
okay.
I love this. Yeah, no, I read Middlemarch for the first time while I was writing the book. It actually came, a friend of mine is an English professor at UCLA, and she's a romantics expert. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for, one of the characters in the book is a big reader. And there was sort of a moment when you kind of learn that she's a big reader, and I was like, I need a classic that the other ones never read, and I wanted something that had like some themes that the book was trying to explore, like marriage and ambition. Mm-hmm. And so I texted my friend, I was like, make me look smart. Like, what should we do here? She's like, Middlemarch, I guess. I was like, I've never read it, I should try it. And I read it, and then I found myself like going around to people being like, have you ever read this book? It's called Middlemarch, it's great. Did you know? Like, which felt ridiculous, but I couldn't stop myself because like, I mean, it's wise and it's funny, and she's like, and it's just great. And and it was such an interesting way to, it's not like, one thing that's really great about this book is it's a book about being an adult, like it's a book about marriage and change and how people change together over time. It's a book about ambition. It's a book about your place in society. It's all this stuff. And I read somewhere once that like a lot of the books from this period that have lasted are about courtship, and this one's about marriage. Like they get married early on, and that part is done. And then it's about how do you live your life as an adult, which I find very interesting.
So I finally read Middlemarch in March of this year for an interview, as interview prep. And two things struck out to me. And the first was I texted a friend in the middle of the night to say, I cannot believe Casaubon added that codicil to his will, and I am mad about it. And if you've read Middlemarch, you know exactly the point that I am making. And I cannot believe I am texting a friend in the middle of the night about a dude from a novel that was published in 1872. What?
Still
salty about it.
Yeah.
Still actually very, very, and because I got attached to Dorothea, and I'm thinking, what is happening here? It's the marriage plot. I don't love novels about the marriage plot. And yet, I got really attached to her to the point where I'm texting in the middle of the night. But the pacing in Middlemarch, right? So it's originally published in installments, and they run roughly 100-page chunks. So I end up reading this book in like 7 days because it's 100-page. I do read very quickly, but 100-page chunks, and the pacing and just the way it's going, and I'm thinking, oh, I think I missed the point on this. And I love Steinbeck. I really, really love Steinbeck, but I'm thinking, this woman from 1870, what? Oh, it was really good.
It was really good.
It was really good, and just I felt like I had the landscape for this community, and just watching the characters interact and how they were, shall we say, disagreeing on some pretty fundamental things.
And a PSA, it's a great audiobook. The woman who does the audiobook that's like $7 or whatever is won a BAFTA for playing Dorothea. And it's a great way, if you're curious about it, it's a really great way to like refamiliarize yourself or familiarize yourself with that kind of language, because the language is different, so it can be hard to like kind of get back into reading it. And it also makes the humor very clear, because the narrator is very funny and the book is very funny, but it's easy to miss sometimes in like the different, in the different language. But the narrator of the audiobook makes it clear that she's great.
But one of the things I appreciate about Middlemarch, and one of the things you do too, is that the humor doesn't date. I think I'm going to come back to How to Sleep at Night and not feel like I'm looking at it I'll have a rough idea of when it's happening, but I'm not going to think, oh, that's 2013.
Yes.
Like that's, and humor is hard. It is really, I mean, yeah, there's the whole thing about comedians being the angriest people you'll ever meet, right? But humor on the page, there are times where I can read, there's some Thurber where I'm like, this is delightful, but wow, what year was this? I want to talk about using humor, though, to get your point across, because all of your couples have moments, and I say this is the sibling couple too. I mean, there are moments where Ethan and Kate are just kind of doing that bickering thing, and if you have siblings, you know what I'm talking about.
Never ends.
They're delightful, but man, you bicker. How do you get that humor to reach a level of timelessness, say, the way an Eliot does? Dalloway, I mean, there's plenty of wit there that actually aged better than some of the other parts of the book.
That's a good question. You know, I think for that one, I don't know. I mean, I think humor is the hardest thing to do well in a book, right?
Yep.
Because it's so, you know, you can be like, I want this character to be funny, like, uh-oh, you know? And I think doing it out loud is really helpful because, like, you can hear if something isn't funny, right? So I think that was a big help. And in terms of the timelessness, I actually have no idea. But, and then I'm working on another book now that, like, some of it takes place in the past. And that's been a thing I've been actually having to think about is sort of like, wait a minute, I wrote a joke that someone made in 1949, and I was like, oh, wait, they wouldn't actually make that joke. It sounds like now. And so I had to take it out until I could come up with something else. Like, that was really challenging. It is absolutely true, because humor really changes, and sort of like the way people use language, way people curse in humor as well, like, is something that you have to kind of remind yourself that you can't do that. Also, because they're recording, so I can't do that. But
Yeah, that was part of the conversation too.
yeah.
Oh. But humor too is, you have to make each character's sense of humor distinct and very individual, and in a way that sounds true to not only their point of view, their experience of the world, and the story you're telling us. So in a way, you've got to hand it over slightly to the strangers in the room.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think I think it's a little bit easier. Like, I think my first drafts are not very funny, and then they get funnier because once you have the voice, it gets a little bit easier. Because if it can feel very like imposed, you know, like you're like, now it's the punchline time, like that's no good. But once you can hear the different characters really, you know, kind of really distinctly, then it's easier to make sure that the jokes actually sound like them, which is very difficult. So, and hopefully, fingers crossed for the next one.
Oh, we're coming back to, I promise we're coming back to the next book. You guys are going to love the idea of this book. And I'm desperate to read it.
That's nice.
I really, really am desperate to read it.
It's not done.
I can be patient. Her editor has the second pass. I have to wait. It's fine. I'm going to sit quietly. Coming back, though, to this idea, though, of novel as context, right? You've got a moment in time that the story sits in. You've got all of the backstories for your characters feeding into this moment in time. So not only are you having to manipulate time as it appears on the page, you've got to deal with their memories. You've got to deal with sort of the way they see what's happening in the world.
Totally.
Are you mapping this out, or are you just kind of going and seeing what happens?
I'm a little bit of a seat of the pantser, right?
Okay.
There's the plotters and the pantsers. I'm a little more of a pantser, but I'm sort of like, this is sort of reporter training. Is I very much I spit out a draft, and it's terrible, but it comes out very quickly, and it helps me. If I can see it, then I can see what's not working, and I can see what's missing, and I can see what needs to be fixed, and so I just sort of go over and over and over and over and over it. I don't remember what your question was. What was it? I forget. I'm sure it was really smart too. I forget.
Just talking about the intersection of memory and time.
You know what's interesting is backstory is like a really hard thing to do well, especially if people have known each other a long time and there's any shifting of time, because backstory can really weigh it down, and it can really make it feel like any forward momentum has stopped. So there's also a lot of backstory that like you have to know in order to write the book that your readers do not care about. And so there's a lot of, you can write as much as you want, but then you have to like really ruthlessly just cut the hell out of it, right? Which I think is better for everybody. And that was like an interesting learning process also, because it's very different. That part is so different from journalism.
So how much of the actual writing of the book then comes from the rewrite?
Most of it, I would say. Yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
But the timeliness thing, to go back to that, like, I mean, the book is, like, it could have been very, like, it's about, families and, like, disagreements and among other things, like political disagreements, right? And that could feel very dated. But when I was sort of had the original idea, I was like, well, this feels like it's going to be around for a while, and sort of speaks to sort of things that like this moment is very extreme, but is sort of this thing that has been happening for a long time and will unfortunately continue to happen for a long time. And so it felt like it was gonna last in that way. So I don't know. It was interesting to think about, though.
Right. It is kind of the only place where you can actually manipulate memory and time.
That's true. That's true. Mm-hmm.
Jess said something in an earlier interview that's in response to Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe has this line, fiction can't keep up with the real world. And Jess's response to that was, I think fiction has the responsibility of a kind of universality that nonfiction doesn't. And, the fact that you and I pulled in a novel from 1872 and another novel from 1925 that basically maybe sort of set the world on fire, but not really, right? Like there's this continuum, right? I do think Jess is right, and I know he's not here to speak for himself, but we're gonna play with this idea anyway, because I think it's so true and so important. Because, right, fiction, it's all made up. I get it. It's all made up. I'm talking about fictional characters like they're real people, right? But I love this idea that you can do something in a way and connect in a way that you might not be able to do with a more serious history or even a pop culture kind of history, right? So you're walking that line, though. You've got your day job. You're a journalist. You've got to stick to the facts. You've got to figure out how to tell us the things we need to know. And then you've got this entirely separate life, including this new novel, which covers what, 50 years, 60 years?
The new one is about 60.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm teeing you up to talk about the new book.
Okay, shall I talk about the new book then?
You can do all of it.
Okay, so the new book is very different. The new book is, which knock on wood, I mean, whatever, it's not done yet, so I'm like, but the new book is about a relationship between two women that starts in 1955, and you follow them for more than half a century, and through them you see how being gay in America changed in one lifetime. So that's the new one. So that's like a whole lot of very different challenges. But that one kind of came from, so I'm 42, and I'm this sort of like funny little microcosm of sort of gay Americans, because when I came out in high school, I was probably the first generation of people to come out in high school. It was like, okay, well, I'm not getting married, I'm not having kids, because that's what it meant. And there just wasn't any sort of, there were gay people who had children. I didn't know of them. I had never heard of them. They were not on TV. It was just not a thing. And then things changed so quickly that I got married at 27. And people who are 10 years older than me had a very different experience where that sort of, the legal changes, if not broader acceptance, didn't come till they were in middle age. And people 10 years younger than me, it was sort of there for their entire adulthood. So we're this sort of just little strip of very kind of remembering when things were really, really different and being kind of young enough to kind of have experienced, benefited from all the fighting people did before. And for years I've just thought about it's crazy, really. It's so hard to explain to people how different it is. And I think people kind of forget. And just thinking about what would that be like to watch two people get married when you were a teenager, it meant you were going to you could be thrown in a state institution for or you get arrested, all of that stuff. And I think just the span of time is very is so dramatic that dramatic things don't need to happen to them. They don't need to be at Stonewall being none of that happens, right? But I've been wondering about this for years, so that was what I tried to do.
But the drama and the history gets built out of these everyday moments,
yes,
right? Every single thing, all of us, we're all in these moments where it's you don't even realize sometimes that the history is happening because you're just oh, it's Tuesday.
Right.
I have to do a thing. I have to live my life. I have to go to work. I have to go to school. I have to do a thing. So the idea, I love these epic novels, right? There's a new novel out by a guy called Patrick Ryan, and it's set in Ohio. It's called Buckeye. And it's it's smaller scope, but it follows a couple of families in a tiny town in Ohio. between the wars, between World War I and, well, post-World War I up until about Vietnam. And you get so, it's like Alice Elliott Dark's Fellowship Point, too, which follows a friendship between two women, again, over about 50 years, based on a plot of land in Maine.
I'm a New Yorker. I love real estate.
Yeah, oh, we've had those conversations. But the idea, right, that you can take the scope of history and reflect it through these characters. I mean, that's part of why I love Ethan and Gabe and Kate and Nicole and Chloe, even the 5-year-old coming back to How to Sleep at Night. They're of their time, they're of their place, and yet I don't feel like I'm stuck in pick a year.
Thank you.
Right?
Can I talk about the kids for a second?
Sure, why not?
The kids were so fun to write. So my kids were young. I mean, they're still young, but they were very young when I started this. And I do think that, like, you know, parenthood is so central to, like, a lot of the book is about your sort of identity and how you see yourself, right? And parenthood obviously just like blows all of that up. And but kids are really often just like props, like they're just like a tiny, you know, they're just little tiny adults wandering around. Alice Wynne, who's this great author who wrote In Memoriam, said something once about how in some action books there could be like any woman could be just replaced by like sexy lamp, and just like in a lot of books like children could just be like adorable lamp, and so we're trying really hard not to do that, and that it was, but they're fun because, like, you know, children they're just so weird, you know, they're so unlike adults. They're surprising, and like that's the best humor, right? Is you're going to surprise people, and they make, just like in terms of like creating like the texture of a book, they're great because they like the tone changes like that once a kid is in the room, and they're like really, and they're like part of the conversation, and they're just so different than, you know, kind of the way that we interact as adults. And so that was like a really fun thing to get to do. And I also have a little list on my phone of like funny things my children have said over the years. And so I don't think I lifted anything directly, but it was a good reminder of sort of like, okay, when they were that age, they said that ridiculous thing. Fantastic. Okay, so that was fun.
Children are also accidentally truth tellers in a lot of times, too,
yeah.
because they'll notice the thing and then they'll just say it.
Not an accident. They're just like, you are lying to me, and I'm going to tell you about it. Yeah.
When do we lose that? Like, is it adolescence where we stop doing that? Like, when do we stop pointing out like the obvious thing in front of us?
I don't know. I think 10-ish.
10-ish?
I think
Okay.
preteens, because then they're aware of how they're going to be perceived when they tell you that your outfit is ugly. So, which maybe they want, but you know, they're aware of the give back as well.
Okay.
It can be very useful to be told your outfit is ugly if you haven't left the house yet, though. Just saying. Anyway.
I don't know. I'm still thinking about something. I'm going to jump back for a second because the children are the children. The two novels, though, the new book that you can't really talk about fully, and How to Sleep at Night, they're on a continuum too. I mean, Kate and Nicole and Gabe and Ethan get this life, this very suburban life.
Right. Yeah, I wrote this book is very much like, the first book is very much like these people just happen to be gay. Like, it arrives, you know, you kind of arrive at a point where everyone knows who they are. Like, even the woman who's married to a man, like she's bi, or however you want to put it. But she's comfortable with that. Her husband knows. It's just she could have married a man or a woman. She married a man, you know, and that's, and so there's really no like angst about it. And that I wanted, you know, I think that's such a privilege to be at a point where there can be books like that, where like that's not the central, you know, that's not the central theme. And so that was very fun. But yes, that comes from somewhere, you know, like it didn't just go poof. Like a lot of people had to do a lot of things in order to make them not have to fret about it. So, yeah.
It's this constant reminder, right, that books feed who we are, that books reflect where we are, where we've been, where we're going. I mean, I get so much pleasure out of being dropped into a world that, listen, I'm not from suburban New Jersey. all props to the people who live in the burbs, but
Me neither. And the
I
best
know.
compliment I got on this book, one of them was someone was like, "What town in New Jersey do you live in?" I was like, "Yes, gotcha. All right."
you did your job.
I did. Research. Go.
Okay, research, but you have to be able to approach the research in a way that doesn't make me feel like I'm reading a history book.
Yes.
So how do you strip out the stuff you don't need?
I think for me, some of that happens in the edits, right? Where like there's a sort of dump of the original stuff of like, these are all the things that I know, and then very quickly it's like, oh, nope, they don't need to know any of that. That's fine, right? So I think a lot of it is in that portion for me. So, but this is great. This is a great skill of a reporter. Is you know everything is tight as can be, right? And you have to, you don't just kill your darlings, right? It's like mass slaughter event with every story has to be, as short as it possibly can be. And so this book, I actually cut. So it's about 80. It's like roughly 82,000 words, and I cut 15 or 17,000 words. So I cut like 20% of the book, basically, in the last round. And my editor was like, "It's a little too long, make it a little shorter." And I was like, "No problem." And I just sliced it, and it was actually really fun. I thought it was going to be terrible, but I actually really enjoyed it because I could feel it working better. And I was like, "This is not necessary." And somebody, Lauren Groff, who's obviously wonderful, bow down to Lauren Groff once. Told me that, gave me some advice, which is make a list of every single scene in the book and what changes. And so it can be either like plot development or a real change in how the reader sees the character. And if what it does is minor or you've done it before, get rid of it. And you can like take, if there are pieces in the scene you need to save and put somewhere else, that's fine, but the scene is not worth it if it doesn't actually change something. And so that was really helpful for me in cutting the first one and the second one. It's a great trick.
So everything in service to story.
Yes.
Okay. Fates and Furies, what, 2008? Is that one?
And later than that, I think.
Was it late? 12?
I don't know, 14, 12? I don't know.
Lauren Groff's Fates and Furies,
Really?
where she does this very clever thing when the story flips in the middle of the book. That was also an influence on How to Sleep at Night, but not tonally.
No.
But I want to talk about pulling that as an influence too, because there's some other straight lines that we've drawn in this conversation, but that one always feels like a little bit out of left field. And
Fair. So that book is, first of all, fantastic, and it's about a marriage, and it's told, the first half is told from the husband's perspective, and the second half is told from the wife's perspective, and it is so unexpected, and basically he doesn't know his wife at all, and it really blew my mind. It's really original, and also just the way that people cannot know each other and be together for, I forget how long, 20 years in that book, something like 20. And was fascinating and so well done, and is both an interesting kind of, is an interesting reflection of their relationship, but also them as individuals. Like, what is it about him that he just like doesn't notice her? And what is it about her that she doesn't want him to? And the way that she kind of creates that is really interesting. And so I was in revisions when I read that book, but it was definitely, that just sort of a new way of looking at like, okay, like also just sort of a reminder to like surprise people wherever you can, and like that's a really, this is not a thriller, like, sorry, no one drops dead, whatever it was you said right now, but maybe next time. But there, it is really important to like, keep to surprise people in whatever way you can, that was one of the main takeaways I had from that one. Also, it's just great. So.
it is fabulous. It's also time for audience questions.
Okay.
So we have a microphone here, we have a microphone here. Please feel free to head up if you have questions. If you don't, we can keep talking, I promise you.
This is true.
But I would really like to hear what you guys are thinking, because I realize this was maybe not the program you were fully anticipating, but we had to pivot
Thank you for
quickly.
staying, by
So
the way.
yeah, seriously, we had to pivot really quickly. Hence the addition of some stuff that we were not totally planning on. And if you don't have questions, you don't have questions, but it's always more fun to hear from you guys. On that note, we'll just keep talking for a moment. Oh, hi.
Hello.
So I haven't read the book.
Okay, cool.
I am curious how, considering how depressing politics is nowadays.
Yeah.
How did you balance that in your tone, or did you try to avoid it and talk about this Republican versus Democrat? Like, how did you manage?
So let's see. I guess that was definitely a challenge, right? Because I wanted to I wanted to write about this thing because I think we're all dealing with this, right? Like whether it's in your family or in your town or like we all if you live in this country, you have to think about how to live with people who don't agree with you, and it can be really upsetting and really hard. But yeah, like I didn't want it to be depressing. I didn't want it to feel like homework. I didn't even want it to feel like the newspaper at all, right? And so a lot of that was characters and trying to make people who are having fun with each other, you know, and and in various ways, because it's not just that couple, and people who are funny and things like that, and also just yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was really hard, but I think I had a lot of fun writing it. And I think that was probably really the key, is that I really enjoyed it. And so I think it keeps it from feeling heavy. And it's, you know, trying to engage with these serious topics, but in a way that is hopefully pleasant to read. So, but because it's not engaging with it's not like taking apart affirmative action and talking about the two sides, right? Like, you know where people stand on a few key issues so that you can kind of place them. But it's really not kind of trying to convince anybody of that sort of stuff. It's just trying to look at how does this one couple try to make it work in this really difficult thing that we're all doing. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question about your characters.
Okay.
I haven't read your book, but with respect to both your first and your second book, to what extent do you inhabit the characters, and to what extent do you find that the characters change in a way that you did not intend? In other words, to what extent are you so involved with your characters and then the characters do something that you didn't really expect them to do, but you as a fiction writer are following what you think your characters do?
Totally. I mean, to your first question, I think one thing that's really fun about fiction writing for me is that you really live with these people. I took 10 months off from the New York Times to write the second book, and I wondered, I was I'm going to be sitting in a room by myself for a year. Am I going to be lonely? And I never felt lonely because I just had these people with me all the time, and they really feel real in that way. And they feel like my friends. They don't feel like me, but they feel like these people that I'm spending all this time with who are just sort of always back here. And yeah, I mean, there were definitely things that I was we will go in this direction. This does not work at all. We will now go in this direction, right? And they will definitely guide you, right? Because you can have a general gist of where you think you're kind of going, or at least for me, but it doesn't usually work. So, because once I get to know them better as I'm writing them, and as by the end of the first draft, kind of, and then I go through it again, I know them a little better, I go through it again, I know them a little better, and so things kind of have to change as you kind of realize what they would do, if that makes sense. So, thank you for your question.
Hi.
Hello.
I am curious about the editing process.
Sure.
So you said you had to cut a lot and you were happy to do that.
Yes.
Was there anything you weren't happy to do? And also, because it deals with politics, was there any pressure to make it more of the moment?
So last question first. Actually, no, because everyone wanted it to last, and there are no real politicians in the book. There is nothing that gives it a particular moment in that way, because I think everyone was hoping that this wouldn't just be a book that was relevant for a year or two, which can happen with nonfiction, right? But for this, the hope was no. So everyone was on the same page on that. And the editing process was great. I love my editor, and it's a very different process than newspaper editing, because my editor at work is my boss. And so if they're we are cutting half of your story and changing the top and whatever, and you kind of have to convince them that they're wrong. Otherwise, that is what's happening. But book editing is much more author-led in a way. My editor is wonderful and has made this book and the second book so much better. But she wouldn't be you know, we're cutting the book in half and I'm changing this and I'm changing this. Like she's like, here are my suggestions and let's talk about them. So it's very collaborative in that way. It's lovely. And I mean, newspaper editing is great, but it's also like, it's just a different mission, right? Like I don't own a word of, I've written thousands of stories, I don't own a word of it, you know, and like your name is on it, but really the New York Times is on it. So like it's very much like this is the institution informing you as opposed to like the author, like the author's voice and the author's, you know, vision or whatever, like that kind of thing. So it's fascinating. It's like a totally different process. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. One of the questions I have is about author and character dynamics and how that actually informs what the reader's going to pick up. So as you're writing, I'm also a fiction writer.
Cool.
So I'm curious, how do you approach character development from the perspective of the way you engage with the character and how much you put into them and being vulnerable, and then how much you want the reader to pick up on that process? What's your comfort level and how do you go through that?
So, okay, let me make sure I understand this. So like, you mean how much of myself I put into there? Is that what you mean? Yeah. That's a good question. I think I don't see, there's not, you know, okay, I have two answers to that. On the one hand, I think, you know, I don't really see any of the characters I've written in either book. Like none of them are really me. But Lauren Groff, again, said, so okay, my wife read my first book, and one of her first responses is she's like, you aren't any of these people, but also there's you in all of them, right? And I said that to Lauren Groff, and she's like, well, yeah, of course. Like this is your book. Like you're going to be in every character you ever write. So I think the whole thing is like a very vulnerable experience, right, in that way, and that's very interesting. But I think like it's very, the process of it is so solitary, right? And you kind of, or at least I forget that anyone's ever going to read it. And the first one I wrote being like, no one's ever going to read this. Who knows if it's even going to be published? We'll see. And so it's been really fun to then see it out in the world and have people engage with it in that way, and like that's really cool. But I find I don't know. I don't think that much about how the readers are going to see them until late in the process. Earlier, it's more just like, okay, what do they sound like? Who are they? What do they want? What do they want right now? Like that, just trying to get to know them first. And I do feel like they feel separate from me even when they're not, I think. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we have time for one last question.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So when you write something as long as a book, how do you keep track of your own story? Especially you mentioned like the list of scenes, you have all the different characters and plot points. Does it come naturally to you that you remember every single thing you're doing? Do you have to go back? Do you have tips and tricks for that?
I would say in the original drafting process, I just like write it and see what happens, and it's messy and things are redundant and whatever, and you clean it up later. I really actually like that sort of list thing later in it because it does help you spot redundancies in particular and places where it's just not that much is happening. I keep a list of things, you know, like big dates and stuff like that, but it's not much. I don't write down very much. I more like have a list. I have various lists in various places of like things I want to change that just like occur to me while I'm making dinner or whatever. So those are more of the things I write down. And then at the end, when I want to make sure I can see the whole thing in like an efficient way, then it's helpful to like have kind of a master list of stuff. So, but everyone's different. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say thank you to Elizabeth Harris. I'm going to say thank you to the audience. Thank you to the National Book Festival.
Yay, thank you,
for
everybody.
hosting us again.
Thank you for coming.